I'm Samantha Rodriguez, 28 years old, and I'm standing on the front lawn of what used to be my family home, watching my entire life get thrown out like garbage. My father just tossed my belongings onto the perfectly manicured grass while my mother's funeral flowers still sit by the front door. 20 years I lived here. 20 years I called this man Dad. 3 years I sacrificed everything to care for my dying mother. And he couldn't even wait 24 hours after her burial to destroy me completely. Before we dive into this nightmare, I need to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below, hit that like button if you believe family should mean something, and make sure to subscribe because this story has twists that'll leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about blood versus love. Let me take you back to where this horror story began. I wasn't born into the Rodriguez family. When I was 8 years old, my biological parents died in a devastating car crash on Interstate 95 during a winter storm. I had no other relatives, no safety net, nothing except the clothes on my back and trauma that would take years to process. That's when Richard and Isabella Rodriguez stepped forward to adopt me through their church's outreach program. For 2 decades, I believed I had found my forever family. Isabella, my adoptive mother, became everything to me. She was the one who held me during nightmares about the crash. She taught me how to braid my hair, helped with homework, cheered at every school play and graduation ceremony. She made me feel like I belonged somewhere, like I was chosen rather than abandoned. Richard seemed distant but not unkind. He provided for us, worked long hours as a cardiologist, and I assumed his reserved nature was just his personality. Everything changed 3 years ago when Isabella was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctors gave her 6 months to live, but she fought for 36 months with every ounce of strength she possessed. During those 3 years, I made a decision that would ultimately destroy my life as I knew it. I quit my position as a registered nurse at Metropolitan General Hospital, broke up with my longtime boyfriend James because I couldn't give him the attention he deserved, and moved back into my childhood bedroom to become Isabella's full-time caregiver. I handled everything. Every doctor's appointment, every medication schedule, every middle-of-the-night crisis when the pain became unbearable. I learned to administer IVs, manage feeding tubes, and coordinate with hospice care. I spent my life savings on experimental treatments insurance wouldn't cover. I researched clinical trials, drove Isabella to appointments 4 hours away, and held her hand through every chemotherapy session that left her weak and nauseated for days afterward. During this time, Richard's behavior toward me began to shift in ways that felt uncomfortable but that I attributed to stress and grief. He started making comments about how I was playing the devoted daughter for everyone to see. He questioned my motives, suggesting I was only caring for Isabella because I expected some kind of inheritance. The accusations stung because they were so far from the truth. I loved my mother. She had saved me from the foster care system and given me a real home. Taking care of her wasn't a strategy for financial gain, it was the least I could do to repay 20 years of unconditional love. The first major attack came the day after Isabella's funeral. Richard had insisted on hosting a wake at the house, and nearly 200 people filled our home to pay their respects. I was in the kitchen preparing food when I heard Richard's voice rising above the conversation in the living room. He was speaking to Dr. Morrison and several other colleagues from the hospital where he worked. "People need to understand what really happened here," Richard said, his voice carrying the authority he used when lecturing medical students. "Samantha isn't really our daughter. She was just a charity case we took in 20 years ago. Isabella got too attached, and now Samantha thinks she deserves something for playing nurse for a few months. She manipulated a dying woman into believing she was indispensable." The kitchen went silent. Mrs. Chen from next door stopped slicing ham. Father Miguel from our church set down the coffee pot he'd been refilling. Everyone stared at me with expressions ranging from pity to suspicion. I felt my face burn with humiliation as whispers started spreading through the house like wildfire. In less than 5 minutes, Richard had reduced 20 years of genuine love and sacrifice to a calculated con game. But Richard wasn't finished destroying me. As guests began leaving, my stepbrother Marcus Jr. arrived from his art-dealing business in London. I hadn't seen him in over 2 years, but he immediately embraced Richard and began speaking in low tones about protecting the family from opportunists. Marcus Jr. had always resented that his parents adopted me, viewing me as competition for attention and resources. Now, with Isabella gone, he saw an opportunity to align with Richard and eliminate me from the family equation permanently. Within hours of Marcus Jr.'s arrival, I discovered that Richard had already taken steps to financially destroy me. He had removed me from all family accounts where Isabella had added me as a beneficiary for emergencies during her illness. My credit cards, which were linked to the family accounts, had been cancelled. The cell phone I'd used for years was disconnected. Even the keys to Isabella's car, which I'd been using to take her to medical appointments, were confiscated. By 10 o'clock that night, I found myself sitting in my 15-year-old Honda Civic in the parking lot of Mel's Diner on Route 12, with nowhere to go and less than $300 to my name. Everything I owned was in garbage bags in my back seat. I called my former supervisor at Metropolitan General, hoping I could return to nursing, but Richard had already contacted the hospital administration. Dr. Peterson, the chief of staff and Richard's golf partner, had put a note in my file suggesting I had personal issues that made me unsuitable for patient care. The next morning, while I was washing my face in the diner's restroom, my phone rang. It was attorney Samuel Whitman from Whitman, Barnes and Associates. He explained that he had been Isabella's personal lawyer for over 15 years and needed to schedule a meeting with me regarding her estate. He wouldn't discuss details over the phone, but his tone suggested there were complications I needed to understand. We arranged to meet at his office the following Tuesday, which gave me 4 days to figure out how to survive until then. Those 4 days living in my car taught me things about desperation I never imagined I'd need to know. I survived on dollar menu items and truck stop coffee, showering at a 24-hour gym where I still had a membership from before Isabella got sick. The nights were the worst part. Sleeping in my car behind the diner, I jumped at every sound, terrified that Richard would report my vehicle as stolen or that police would arrest me for loitering. On Tuesday morning, I cleaned myself up as best I could and drove to Attorney Whitman's office in downtown Springfield. His receptionist, a kind woman named Dorothy, offered me coffee and seemed genuinely sympathetic when I explained I'd been having family difficulties since Isabella's death. When Mr. Whitman called me into his office, I could tell from his expression that whatever he needed to discuss was serious. "Samantha, I've been handling legal matters for your mother for the past 15 years, he began, settling behind an impressive mahogany desk covered with legal documents. Isabella came to see me approximately 6 months ago with some very specific instructions regarding her will and estate planning. She was particularly concerned about ensuring certain information remained confidential until after her death." He explained that Isabella's will reading was scheduled for the following Friday, but he wanted to prepare me for potential complications. Richard had already contacted the firm 3 times, demanding immediate access to all estate documents and insisting that any inheritance left to me should be contested based on my manipulation of Isabella during her illness. Mr. Whitman assured me that Isabella had been completely mentally competent when she updated her will and had actually anticipated that Richard might try to interfere with her final wishes. While I was meeting with the attorney, Richard and Marcus Jr. were launching their second major attack against me. They had spent the weekend contacting everyone who knew our family, spreading rumors that I had been stealing money from Isabella's medication fund and forging checks from her account. Mrs. Patterson, who had been our neighbor for 18 years, crossed the street to avoid me when I returned to collect mail from the house. Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan, who used to invite me over for Sunday dinners, suddenly acted like I didn't exist when I waved to them from my car. The lies Richard was telling seemed to gain credibility because people couldn't understand why he would turn against me so completely unless I had done something terrible. After all, he was a respected cardiologist with an impeccable reputation in the community. Why would a man like that destroy his adopted daughter's life without good reason? The whispers followed me everywhere I went. Bank tellers who had known me for years suddenly scrutinized my identification with suspicious eyes. The pharmacist at CVS, where I'd picked up Isabella's prescriptions for 3 years, asked to see multiple forms of ID when I tried to fill my own prescription for anxiety medication my doctor had prescribed after Isabella's death. The financial warfare escalated when Marcus Jr. convinced the manager at First National Bank to freeze the small account I had opened with my final nursing paycheck from Metropolitan General. He claimed I was under investigation for elder abuse and that any assets I possessed might be stolen from the family estate. Even though the money was legitimately mine, earned from my own employment, the bank manager erred on the side of caution and froze the account pending legal clarification. This left me with exactly $47 in cash and no way to access my own earnings. On Thursday afternoon, the psychological torture reached a new level when 2 police officers arrived at Mel's diner to question me about allegations of prescription drug theft. Someone had called in an anonymous tip claiming I had been stealing pain medication from Isabella during her final months and selling the pills to support a drug addiction. The accusation was so far from the truth it would have been laughable if it weren't destroying my life. I had meticulously tracked every pill Isabella received, working with hospice nurses to ensure she had adequate pain management without risking dependency or overdose. Officer Martinez and Officer Thompson were professional but thorough. They searched my car, questioned me about my financial situation, and asked detailed questions about Isabella's medication regimen. I provided them with the complete records I'd kept, including photos of pill counts and notes from every interaction with her medical team. After 2 hours of investigation, they concluded that the allegations were unfounded, but the damage was done. Word spread quickly through our small community that I was under police investigation for drug-related crimes. That evening, as I sat in my car outside the police station, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered, I heard the familiar voice of Catherine Mitchell, one of the hospice nurses who had worked with Isabella during her final months. Catherine had been more than a medical professional. She had become a friend who understood the emotional toll of watching someone you love die slowly and painfully. "Samantha, I heard what's happening to you, and it's absolutely disgusting," Catherine said, her voice tight with anger. "I worked with your mother for 8 months, and I saw how much you sacrificed to take care of her. Richard's accusations are not only false, they're cruel beyond description." Catherine explained that Isabella had given her a sealed envelope during one of their last conversations, with specific instructions that it should only be opened if something happens to Samantha after I'm gone. Isabella had been concerned about Richard's increasing hostility and wanted to make sure I had protection if he tried to hurt me after her death. Catherine had been reluctant to interfere in family matters, but Richard's public character assassination had convinced her that Isabella's fears were justified. "Your mother was very clear about this," Catherine continued. "She said you were the most important thing in her life and that she'd made arrangements to protect you, but she needed someone outside the family to help make sure her plans weren't sabotaged. She chose me because she knew I cared about you and because I had witnessed how devoted you were to her care. We arranged to meet the next morning at a coffee shop across town, away from the neighbors and family friends who had turned against me." Catherine warned me that Richard had been asking questions about Isabella's medical records and had even tried to get information from other hospice staff members about what Isabella might have said during private conversations. It was becoming clear that Richard wasn't just angry about potential inheritance issues, he was actively working to prevent me from accessing whatever Isabella had left for me. That night, for the first time since the funeral, I felt a spark of hope. Isabella had anticipated this nightmare and had taken steps to help me survive it. As I tried to sleep in my car behind the diner, I thought about all the times during her illness when Isabella had asked me questions that seemed unrelated to her medical care. She had wanted to know about my childhood before the adoption, about my dreams for the future, about whether I felt truly loved and secure in our family. At the time, I had assumed she was simply trying to process her own mortality and strengthen our bond before she died. Now I realized she might have been gathering information she needed to protect me from Richard's cruelty. The next morning brought another devastating blow when I arrived at the coffee shop and found Richard waiting in the parking lot. He had somehow discovered my meeting with Catherine and had positioned himself to intercept me before I could speak with her privately. As I walked toward the entrance, Richard stepped out of his Mercedes and blocked my path with an expression of cold fury I'd never seen before. "You need to stop this pathetic charade immediately," he said, his voice low but menacing. "Isabella is gone, and your free ride is over. Whatever lies you've convinced that nurse to tell, whatever manipulation you think you can pull with some lawyer, it ends now. You have no legal right to anything that belonged to my wife, and I will spend every penny I have to make sure you get nothing." For the first time since Isabella's death, something inside me snapped. 20 years of trying to earn Richard's approval, 3 years of sacrificing everything for Isabella's care, and a week of public humiliation had pushed me beyond my breaking point. I looked directly into his eyes and spoke with a strength that surprised us both. "Isabella was my mother in every way that mattered, and she loved me enough to make sure I'd be protected from people like you," I said. "Whatever you're afraid I'm going to find out, whatever secrets you're trying to hide, it's too late. Isabella saw through your act long before she died, and she made sure the truth would come out." Richard's face went white, and for a moment I saw something that looked like genuine fear in his eyes. He stepped closer to me, close enough that I could smell his expensive cologne and see the pulse beating rapidly in his neck. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," he whispered. "Isabella may have felt sorry for you, but sentiment won't protect you from the real world. I suggest you take whatever small amount she might have left you and disappear before you force me to take more serious measures." Catherine was waiting for me inside the coffee shop, having witnessed the confrontation with Richard through the window. Her face was pale with concern as I sat down across from her, my hands still shaking from the intensity of Richard's threats. She immediately pulled a manila envelope from her purse and slid it across the table toward me. "Isabella made me promise to give this to you if Richard started acting exactly the way he's acting now," Catherine said quietly. "She told me to watch for signs that he was trying to isolate you or destroy your reputation in the community. She said Richard had done this before, to someone else, and that she'd spent years gathering evidence to protect you from the same treatment." My fingers trembled as I opened the envelope and pulled out several sheets of paper covered in Isabella's careful handwriting. The letter was dated just 6 weeks before her death, during a period when I thought she was too weak to focus on anything except managing her pain. Instead, she had been documenting 20 years of secrets that Richard had kept hidden from everyone, including me. "My dearest Samantha," the letter began. "If you are reading this, it means Richard has shown his true nature after my death, just as I feared he would. I need you to know that everything you believed about our family has been built on lies he has carefully maintained for decades. The man you called Dad has been living a double life that I only discovered 3 years ago, when his carelessness finally gave him away." Isabella's letter revealed that she had accidentally discovered Richard's 20-year affair with Dr. Sarah Henderson, a pathologist at Metropolitan General Hospital. But the affair was only the beginning of Richard's deception. Isabella had hired a private investigator who uncovered evidence that Richard had been embezzling money from his medical practice and from several business partnerships he'd formed with other doctors. Over 2 decades, he had stolen nearly $800,000 by inflating billing, falsifying insurance claims, and creating fake vendor contracts that funneled money into accounts he controlled. "The reason Richard turned against you so viciously after my diagnosis is that he realized I was going to leave you a substantial inheritance," Isabella's letter continued. "He has been desperately trying to hide his financial crimes, and he knows that if you inherit enough money to be financially independent, you might discover the truth about what he's been doing. He has been embezzling from accounts that he thought I didn't know about, including money that was supposed to be set aside for your college education and future security. The letter included photocopies of bank statements, email exchanges between Richard and Dr. Henderson, and documentation of the private investigator's findings. Isabella had spent the final year of her life secretly gathering evidence while pretending to be too sick to pay attention to family finances. She had even recorded several phone conversations where Richard discussed his plans to get rid of the charity case after Isabella died. But the most shocking revelation came in the final paragraph of the letter. Isabella revealed that she had contacted attorney Whitman 6 months before her death to completely restructure her estate planning. She had quietly moved assets into trusts and accounts that Richard couldn't access, and she had updated her will to include specific provisions designed to protect me from Richard's expected retaliation. "Samantha, you need to know that you were never a charity case to me," Isabella wrote. "You were the daughter I had prayed for, and watching you grow into the compassionate, intelligent woman you became has been the greatest joy of my life. The money I'm leaving you is not a gift. It's your birthright as my daughter. Richard will try to convince you that you don't deserve it, but don't let him destroy your sense of self-worth the way he tried to destroy mine." As I finished reading the letter, Catherine reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Isabella also gave me this," she said, pulling a small brass key from her pocket. "She said it opens a safety deposit box at First National Bank, and that everything I would need to protect myself is inside that box." Before I could fully process the implications of Isabella's letter, my phone buzzed with a text message from attorney Whitman. Richard had filed an emergency motion to have me declared mentally incompetent to receive any inheritance, claiming that my drug addiction and history of manipulative behavior made me unfit to manage financial assets. The hearing was scheduled for Monday morning, giving me only 3 days to prepare a defense against accusations I never saw coming. That afternoon, as I sat in my car trying to understand how my life had become a legal battlefield, I received another devastating blow. A process server found me in the diner parking lot and handed me a restraining order that Richard had obtained by claiming I had threatened him and Marcus Jr. with physical violence. The order prohibited me from coming within 500 feet of the family property, which meant I couldn't visit Isabella's grave or retrieve any personal belongings Richard hadn't already destroyed. The legal restrictions were strategically designed to isolate me completely. I couldn't return to the house to gather important documents or family photos that proved my 20-year relationship with Isabella. I couldn't access Isabella's grave to find comfort in the one place that still felt connected to her love. Most importantly, I couldn't confront Richard about the evidence in Isabella's letter because any contact with him would result in my immediate arrest for violating the restraining order. Saturday morning brought news that Richard had hired Patterson, White & Associates, the most expensive legal firm in the state, to contest any inheritance I might receive from Isabella's estate. The firm was known for representing wealthy clients in high-stakes divorce and inheritance disputes, and they had a reputation for using aggressive tactics to destroy opposing parties both financially and personally. Richard was clearly prepared to spend whatever it took to ensure I received nothing from Isabella's estate. But Isabella had anticipated even this level of warfare. That afternoon, I received a phone call from Margaret Thompson, Isabella's closest friend since college and the woman I had considered an honorary aunt throughout my childhood. Margaret explained that Isabella had contacted her 2 months before her death with very specific instructions about what to do if Richard tried to prevent me from receiving my inheritance. Isabella knew exactly what kind of man Richard really was, Margaret said, her voice heavy with sadness and anger. She spent 20 years pretending not to see his affairs and his financial manipulations because she was protecting you. She was terrified that if she divorced him or exposed his crimes while you were still young, he would find ways to hurt you out of spite. So she waited until you were old enough to survive on your own, and then she made plans to give you the resources you'd need to build a life free from his control. Margaret revealed that Isabella had been secretly transferring assets into accounts that Richard didn't know existed for over a year before her death. She had sold jewelry, cashed in investments, and liquidated savings accounts that she had inherited from her own parents decades earlier. The money had been moved into trusts and offshore accounts that would become accessible to me after her death, but only if I could prove my identity and relationship to Isabella through DNA testing and legal documentation. Your mother was incredibly intelligent about financial planning, Margaret continued. She worked with attorneys and financial advisors that Richard had never met, using her maiden name and old business contacts from before her marriage. She created a completely separate financial identity that he knew nothing about, and she spent months making sure every transfer was legal and properly documented. The conversation with Margaret gave me hope, but it also revealed how dangerous my situation had become. If Isabella had hidden millions of dollars from Richard, his desperation to prevent me from inheriting that money explained the extreme measures he was taking to destroy my credibility and legal standing. He wasn't just being cruel, he was fighting for his financial survival. Sunday evening, as I prepared for what would likely be the most important legal hearing of my life, Marcus Jr. made his own contribution to the family's campaign against me. He attempted to seduce Catherine, taking her out for an expensive dinner and offering her money to testify that Isabella had been mentally impaired during her final months and that I had manipulated her into changing her will. When Catherine refused and threatened to report his attempted bribery to Attorney Whitman, Marcus Jr. became hostile and warned her that the Rodriguez family had resources and connections that could make her life very difficult if she continued supporting me. Catherine immediately called to warn me about Marcus Jr.'s tactics, but she also shared something that gave me renewed determination to fight for Isabella's legacy. During their conversation, Marcus Jr. had accidentally revealed that Richard was planning to leave the country within 6 months, moving to a non-extradition country where he could avoid prosecution if his financial crimes were ever discovered. Richard wasn't just trying to steal my inheritance, he was preparing to disappear permanently, leaving behind a trail of financial destruction that would ruin his business partners and the patients whose trust funds he had embezzled from. That night, sleeping in my car behind the diner, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of simply defending myself against Richard's attacks, I was going to use Isabella's evidence to expose his crimes and protect his future victims. Isabella hadn't just given me the tools to claim my inheritance, she had given me the power to bring justice for everyone Richard had betrayed and stolen from over the past 20 years. Monday morning arrived gray and cold, matching the dread that had settled in my chest as I prepared for the competency hearing. I had managed to clean myself up in the diner's restroom and put on the one professional outfit I'd been able to salvage from my belongings, but I felt completely overwhelmed by the legal battle ahead. Richard's attorney team looked formidable as they set up their files in the courthouse, while I sat alone with just Attorney Whitman and the evidence Isabella had left me. Before the hearing began, I made a crucial decision. Using the brass key Isabella had given Catherine, I drove to First National Bank and accessed the safety deposit box she had mentioned in her letter. Inside, I found documents that changed everything I thought I knew about my identity and my relationship to the Rodriguez family. The first document was a DNA test report dated just 8 months before Isabella's death. According to the results, I shared significant genetic markers with Richard Rodriguez, indicating a 99.7% probability that he was my biological father. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Isabella had somehow discovered that I wasn't an adopted stranger at all, I was Richard's biological daughter, born from an affair he'd had before marrying Isabella. The second document was a private investigator's report revealing the full scope of Richard's deception. 29 years ago, Richard had an affair with a nurse named Maria Santos while Isabella was traveling in Europe for graduate school. When Maria became pregnant, Richard convinced her to keep the pregnancy secret and promised to support the child financially. Maria had agreed, believing Richard would eventually leave Isabella to marry her. Instead, Richard married Isabella as planned and provided minimal support for Maria and their daughter. The report included copies of child support payments Richard had made for 7 years, always in cash and always with threats about what would happen if Maria ever tried to contact Isabella or claim that Richard was the father. When Maria and her husband were killed in the car crash that left me orphaned, Richard saw an opportunity to eliminate any evidence of his affair while appearing charitable. He convinced Isabella that adopting me would be a wonderful way to start their family, never mentioning that I was already his biological daughter. For 20 years, Richard had watched me grow up in his house, knowing I was his child but treating me like an unwelcome burden. He had allowed me to believe I was a grateful charity case when I was actually his firstborn daughter who deserved love, support, and recognition. The cruelty of this deception was overwhelming, but it also explained why Richard was so desperate to prevent me from inheriting from Isabella. If the truth about my parentage became public, his reputation would be destroyed, and he could face legal consequences for child abandonment and fraud. Armed with this devastating evidence, I felt prepared to face Richard's legal team at the competency hearing. But as I walked toward the courthouse, I was intercepted by Marcus Jr. and two men I didn't recognize. They surrounded me in the parking garage and demanded that I hand over any documents Isabella had left me. "We know she gave you something," Marcus Jr. said, his voice threatening in a way I'd never heard before. "Our father has too much to lose for you to destroy his life with whatever lies Isabella concocted during her illness. You're going to give us those documents, or we're going to take them from you." When I refused to cooperate, they physically forced me into a van and drove me to an isolated cabin about 30 miles outside of town. For the next 6 hours, I was held against my will while Richard and Marcus Jr. alternated between offering me money to disappear and threatening me with violence if I didn't destroy the evidence Isabella had gathered. $2 million in cash, Richard said, pacing back and forth in the small cabin while I sat tied to a chair. "More money than you could spend in a lifetime, and all you have to do is renounce any claim to Isabella's estate and promise never to contact anyone in our family again. You can start a new life anywhere in the world, but you leave our reputation and our business interests intact." When I continued to refuse, Marcus Jr. became violent, striking me across the face and threatening to make sure I never made it back to civilization if I didn't cooperate. They had taken my phone and car keys, and the cabin was too isolated for anyone to hear me if I screamed for help. For several hours, I genuinely believed they might kill me to protect their secrets. The situation became even more desperate when Catherine arrived at the cabin with two men I didn't recognize. My relief at seeing her quickly turned to horror when I realized she hadn't come to rescue me. Catherine had been working with Richard all along, reporting everything I had told her about Isabella's final months and photographing the documents Isabella had left for me. "I'm sorry, Samantha, but you need to understand that Richard has something on me that could destroy my career," Catherine said, avoiding eye contact as she spoke. 5 years ago, I made a mistake with a patient's medication that could have been fatal. Richard covered for me and made sure it never went on my record, but he's kept the evidence all this time. If I don't help him now, he'll report me to the nursing board and I'll lose my license. The betrayal was crushing, but it also revealed how Richard operated. He had been collecting compromising information about people for years, building a network of individuals he could control through blackmail and intimidation. Catherine wasn't evil. She was trapped by her own mistake and Richard's manipulation. As the hours dragged on, I began to lose hope that anyone would find me before Richard and Marcus Jr. decided I was too dangerous to release. They had taken turns questioning me about what Isabella had told me, who else knew about the documents, and whether I had made copies of any evidence. When I continued to refuse to cooperate, they began discussing options that sounded increasingly violent. Just as I was beginning to consider destroying the evidence to save my own life, we heard cars approaching the cabin. Richard cursed and looked out the window, then began frantically gathering papers and whispering urgent instructions to Marcus Jr. and Catherine. Within minutes, the cabin was surrounded by police cars and Detective Sarah Chin was announcing their presence through a bullhorn. Margaret Thompson had saved my life. When I failed to appear for the competency hearing and didn't answer my phone, she had contacted Attorney Whitman, who immediately called the police. Margaret had also provided them with the license plate number of the van that had taken me from the courthouse parking garage, which she had witnessed from her car while waiting to testify on my behalf. Richard was arrested for kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and intimidation of a witness. Marcus Jr. faced similar charges plus assault for striking me during the interrogation. Catherine was taken into custody for conspiracy, though her cooperation with the investigation eventually led to reduced charges. The evidence I had hidden in my car's spare tire compartment remained safe, and Richard's desperate attempt to destroy it had only added serious felony charges to his growing legal problems. That evening, as I sat in the police station giving my statement to Detective Chen, Richard's attorney arrived with a final offer. Richard was willing to plead guilty to reduced charges and transfer $5 million to me immediately if I would agree to sign a non-disclosure agreement and disappear from his life permanently. The offer was tempting after the trauma of the day, but I realized that accepting it would mean abandoning justice for Isabella and for all the other people Richard had victimized over the years. "He's terrified," Detective Chen told me as we reviewed my statement. "Men like Richard Rodriguez don't usually resort to kidnapping unless they're facing complete destruction. Whatever evidence you have, it must be significant enough to send him to prison for a very long time." Tuesday morning brought the official reading of Isabella's will, postponed from Monday due to my kidnapping and the criminal charges against Richard. Attorney Whitman had moved the proceedings to a secure conference room at the courthouse, with additional security measures in place to prevent any further interference from Richard or his associates. Richard attended the reading in handcuffs, accompanied by his criminal defense attorney, while I sat across the table with Margaret and Detective Chen present as witnesses. The will that Attorney Whitman read aloud was unlike anything anyone had expected. Isabella had divided her estate into multiple categories, each with specific conditions and protections designed to ensure that her true intentions couldn't be subverted by legal challenges or family pressure. The document was 37 pages long and had been crafted with the precision of someone who understood exactly what kind of opposition her final wishes would face. The first revelation was the true extent of Isabella's wealth. Over the past 20 years, she had quietly inherited substantial assets from her parents' estate, including real estate investments, stock portfolios, and business partnerships that had grown significantly in value. Additionally, she had been the sole beneficiary of her grandmother's trust fund, which had been carefully managed by financial advisors for over 40 years. The total value of Isabella's estate was $33.2 million, an amount that shocked everyone in the room, including Richard. Isabella Rodriguez was an exceptionally wealthy woman who chose to live modestly and keep her financial status private, Attorney Whitman explained. She inherited the majority of these assets before her marriage to Richard, and she took great care to ensure they remained separate property throughout their relationship. Richard Rodriguez has no legal claim to any portion of this estate. The second revelation was even more dramatic. Isabella had spent the final 3 years of her life systematically moving assets out of any accounts or investments that Richard could access. She had liquidated properties, closed joint accounts, and transferred funds into trusts and offshore holdings that were specifically designed to be invisible to Richard's financial advisors and accountants. She had essentially created a completely separate financial identity while pretending to be a typical housewife with modest savings. The bulk of Isabella's estate, including $27 million in cash and investments, was left to me with very specific conditions. I would receive full access to the funds on my 30th birthday, but until then, the money would be managed by a board of trustees that included Margaret, Attorney Whitman, and 2 financial advisors Isabella had selected for their integrity and independence. The trustees were authorized to provide me with living expenses, educational funding, and resources for any legal battles that might arise from challenging Richard's criminal activities. Isabella had also left detailed instructions for how the money should be used if anything happened to prevent me from claiming it. In that case, the entire estate would be donated to organizations supporting adopted children, elder care facilities, and legal aid societies that help victims of domestic financial abuse. The message was clear: the money would never fall into Richard's hands under any circumstances. But the most devastating revelation came when Attorney Whitman read Isabella's letter explaining her motivations for the elaborate estate planning. Isabella had known about my true parentage for over 2 years before her death. She had hired the private investigator initially to gather evidence about Richard's affairs, but the investigation had revealed the DNA connection between Richard and me. Isabella had been quietly gathering proof of Richard's child abandonment and fraud while pretending to be too sick to pay attention to family matters. "I need the world to know that Samantha Rodriguez is not an adopted daughter who should be grateful for charity," Isabella's letter stated. "She is Richard's biological daughter who was denied her birthright through his cowardice and manipulation. The money I am leaving her is not a gift. It is partial compensation for 20 years of emotional abuse and financial deception. Richard Rodriguez stole her identity, her sense of belonging, and her rightful inheritance. This estate transfer is my attempt to restore what he took from her." The letter continued with detailed instructions for exposing Richard's crimes to the appropriate authorities. Isabella had documented his embezzlement schemes, provided evidence of tax fraud, and compiled records of patients whose trust funds he had stolen from. She had even recorded conversations where Richard discussed his plans to flee the country if his financial crimes were ever discovered. The evidence was comprehensive enough to ensure criminal prosecution and civil lawsuits that would destroy Richard's reputation and eliminate any possibility of him benefiting from his decades of fraud. As Attorney Whitman finished reading the will, Richard's criminal defense attorney requested an immediate recess to consult with his client. The magnitude of evidence against Richard made it clear that fighting the inheritance would be pointless, especially since it would only draw more attention to the criminal activities Isabella had documented. Richard was facing potential decades in prison for kidnapping, embezzlement, tax fraud, and child abandonment. His only hope for any kind of plea agreement depended on his cooperation with prosecutors and his willingness to make restitution to his victims. But Richard wasn't finished trying to destroy me, even from jail. Within hours of the will reading, his attorney filed a motion to have the DNA evidence excluded from any criminal proceedings, claiming it had been obtained illegally and that Isabella had no right to conduct genetic testing without Richard's consent. He also attempted to challenge my legal identity, arguing that if I was indeed his biological daughter, then my adoption by Isabella had been fraudulent and that I had no legal standing to inherit from her estate. The legal maneuvering was complex, but Attorney Whitman had anticipated these challenges. Isabella's estate planning included provisions for exactly this type of dispute, with DNA evidence that had been obtained through legal channels and documented by certified laboratories. Additionally, Isabella had established my legal standing as her daughter through 20 years of documented care, support, and parental relationship that couldn't be invalidated by Richard's biological connection. That afternoon brought another devastating blow when Marcus Jr., despite being in custody, managed to orchestrate an attack on my reputation through social media and local news outlets. Using contacts from his art-dealing business, he had convinced a reporter from Channel 7 News to run a story about the inheritance battle between a grieving family and an opportunistic adopted daughter. The story portrayed me as a manipulative caregiver who had isolated a dying woman from her true family and convinced her to change her will through emotional manipulation. The news report included interviews with several people who claimed to be family friends, though I didn't recognize any of them. They described Richard as a devoted husband who had been devastated by his wife's decision to leave her fortune to someone outside the family bloodline. They portrayed Isabella as a mentally unstable woman whose judgment had been compromised by pain medication and chemotherapy. The story was completely false, but it was professionally produced and convincing enough to turn public opinion against me once again. Mr. Thompson, the corrupt family lawyer who had been secretly working with Richard, had provided the reporter with what appeared to be legitimate legal documents supporting the claims about my manipulation of Isabella. The documents were forgeries, but they looked official enough to convince viewers that the accusations against me had legal merit. Mr. Thompson had been stealing attorney-client privileged information and creating false evidence for months, all in preparation for the inheritance battle that everyone knew was coming. By evening, I was once again being portrayed in the local media as a villain who had taken advantage of a dying woman's vulnerability. The $33 million inheritance was described as suspicious and disproportionate for someone who wasn't a blood relative. The fact that Richard was in jail for kidnapping me was downplayed, while his concerns about my influence over Isabella were presented as the legitimate worries of a loving husband. But this time, I wasn't alone and helpless. Margaret had spent the afternoon contacting Isabella's real friends and former colleagues, people who had known both Isabella and me for years and could speak to the genuine nature of our relationship. Attorney Whitman had prepared a comprehensive response to the news report, including documentation of Richard's criminal charges and evidence of his 20-year deception about my parentage. Detective Chen had also agreed to speak with reporters about the kidnapping incident and Richard's pattern of manipulation and intimidation. Most importantly, I now had the financial resources to fight back effectively. The trustees of Isabella's estate had authorized immediate funding for a top-tier public relations firm and an expanded legal team to handle both the criminal proceedings against Richard and the media campaign to destroy my reputation. For the first time since Isabella's death, I was able to hire professionals who could match Richard's expensive attorneys and sophisticated manipulation tactics. As I sat in Attorney Whitman's office that evening, reviewing the strategy for the battles ahead, I realized that Isabella had given me something more valuable than money. She had provided me with the truth about my identity and the tools to expose Richard's crimes. The scared, homeless young woman who had been thrown out of her family home a week earlier was gone. In her place was Richard's biological daughter, armed with evidence of his decades of fraud and backed by resources that could ensure justice for everyone he had victimized. Wednesday morning marked the beginning of my counterattack against the man who had spent 20 years lying to me about everything that mattered. Using the resources from Isabella's estate, I hired Blackwood and Associates, the same legal firm that had successfully prosecuted several high-profile financial fraud cases in the state. Senior partner Jennifer Blackwood took personal charge of my case, bringing with her a team of investigators, forensic accountants, and media specialists who specialized in exposing white-collar criminals. The first phase of our strategy involved a comprehensive investigation into Richard's financial activities over the past 2 decades. Isabella's evidence provided an excellent starting point, but Jennifer's team needed to build an airtight case that could withstand scrutiny from Richard's expensive defense attorneys. Within 48 hours, they had uncovered evidence of financial fraud that exceeded even Isabella's worst suspicions about Richard's criminal activities. The forensic accounting revealed that Richard had been stealing from his medical practice partners for over 15 years, using a sophisticated system of false billing and dummy vendor accounts to redirect money into personal investments. He had embezzled nearly $1.3 million from the cardiac surgery center where he worked, money that was supposed to fund equipment upgrades and staff bonuses. Additionally, he had been falsifying insurance claims and Medicare billings, collecting payments for procedures that were never performed and for patients who didn't exist. But the most shocking discovery was Richard's manipulation of patient trust funds. As a prominent cardiologist, Richard had been named as the trustee for several elderly patients who needed someone to manage their finances during extended medical treatment. Instead of protecting their assets, Richard had systematically drained their accounts to fund his affair with Dr. Henderson and to pay for luxury purchases that he hid from Isabella. 3 elderly patients had died in poverty because Richard had stolen the money they needed for long-term care, while he used their savings to buy expensive jewelry for his mistress. Margaret proved to be an invaluable ally in exposing Richard's decades of deception. As Isabella's best friend, she had witnessed conversations and received confidences that provided crucial context for understanding Richard's patterns of manipulation. Margaret revealed that Isabella had actually discovered Richard's first affair over 10 years earlier but had stayed silent to protect me from the trauma of divorce and custody battles during my teenage years. Isabella sacrificed her own happiness for your well-being, Margaret explained as we reviewed evidence in Jennifer's conference room. She knew that if she divorced Richard while you were still in high school, he would fight for custody just to hurt her, and you would become a weapon in their battle. So she endured years of humiliation and betrayal, all while secretly documenting everything she would need to protect you once you were old enough to survive on your own. The investigation also revealed that Marcus Jr.'s attempts to manipulate Catherine had backfired spectacularly. When Catherine rejected his bribery offer and reported his tactics to Attorney Whitman, she had triggered a chain of events that exposed additional corruption in Richard's network of enablers. Catherine's cooperation with investigators led to the discovery that several other healthcare workers had been coerced into helping Richard hide his prescription fraud and patient trust fund manipulation. Dr. Morrison, Richard's colleague who had been present during the humiliating wake announcement, came forward with evidence that Richard had been pressuring medical staff to falsify patient records and billing documentation for years. Dr. Morrison had been afraid to speak up earlier because Richard held a position of power at the hospital, but the criminal charges and media attention had given him the courage to expose the full extent of Richard's professional misconduct. Within a week of launching our counterattack, Richard's reputation in the medical community was completely destroyed. The state medical board launched a formal investigation that resulted in the immediate suspension of his medical license. Medicare fraud investigators seized his practice's financial records and froze all accounts pending a full audit. His business partners filed a civil lawsuit demanding restitution for the money he had embezzled, while also distancing themselves from any association with his crimes. The media campaign to restore my reputation proved equally effective. Jennifer's public relations team arranged interviews with Catherine, Margaret, and Dr. Morrison, all of whom provided compelling testimony about Isabella's genuine love for me and Richard's pattern of manipulation and financial abuse. The Channel 7 reporter who had originally portrayed me as a manipulative caregiver was forced to run a correction and apology after being presented with documented evidence that contradicted every claim in his original story. Mr. Thompson, the corrupt attorney who had been secretly working with Richard, faced his own professional destruction when the State Bar Association launched an investigation into his forgery of legal documents and theft of attorney-client privileged information. Thompson's law license was suspended pending criminal charges for fraud, conspiracy, and professional misconduct. The fake documents he had provided to Channel 7 were definitively proven to be forgeries, which discredited Richard's entire media strategy. But the most satisfying moment in our counterattack came when Marcus Jr.'s visa was revoked due to his criminal activities in the United States. Immigration authorities determined that his assault on me and his conspiracy in the kidnapping made him an undesirable alien who posed a danger to public safety. Marcus Jr. was forced to return to London while facing potential extradition back to the United States for trial on the kidnapping charges. The real estate empire that Isabella had secretly built over 2 decades provided another avenue for exposing Richard's financial deception. Isabella had been using her inherited wealth to purchase apartment buildings and commercial properties throughout the region, always using her maiden name and operating through limited liability companies that Richard knew nothing about. The rental income from these properties had been substantial, but Isabella had kept it completely separate from the household finances that Richard managed. Jennifer's team discovered that Isabella's real estate holdings were worth nearly $12 million beyond the liquid assets she had left in her will. The properties had been generating over $600,000 in annual rental income that Isabella had been quietly reinvesting in additional acquisitions and improvements. Richard had been living as the husband of a multimillionaire while believing he was married to a woman with modest inherited savings. The revelation of Isabella's true wealth explained why Richard had been so confident about his financial future despite his embezzlement activities. He had assumed that Isabella's death would give him access to her modest inheritance, which he could use to cover his stolen funds and avoid detection of his crimes. Instead, he discovered that Isabella had been far wealthier than he imagined and that she had deliberately excluded him from any access to her assets. By the end of the week, Richard's desperate attempt to destroy my reputation had completely backfired. Instead of portraying me as a manipulative opportunist, The investigation had revealed that I was the victim of 20 years of psychological abuse and financial fraud by a man who had hidden my true identity while stealing from vulnerable patients and elderly individuals who trusted him with their care. The community response was overwhelmingly supportive once people understood the truth about Richard's character and Isabella's genuine love for me. Mrs. Patterson, who had crossed the street to avoid me after Richard's initial accusations, showed up at Attorney Whitman's office with a homemade casserole and a heartfelt apology for believing Richard's lies. The bank manager who had frozen my legitimate paycheck account called personally to apologize and to offer preferential banking services for managing Isabella's estate. Even Father Miguel from our church, who had initially seemed sympathetic to Richard's portrayal of me as an ungrateful adopted daughter, delivered a Sunday sermon about the importance of truth and justice that was clearly directed at supporting me against Richard's continued manipulation attempts from jail. The congregation responded with a standing ovation that felt like a public vindication of everything Isabella had believed about my character and worth. As we prepared for Richard's criminal trial, Jennifer's team made one final discovery that completed our understanding of his motivations and methods. Hidden in Richard's office safe, investigators found detailed plans for fleeing the country once Isabella died. Richard had been preparing to transfer stolen funds to offshore accounts and had already obtained a false passport under an assumed identity. His plan had been to disappear within 6 months of Isabella's death, leaving behind a trail of financial destruction that would have bankrupted his victims and destroyed the lives of everyone who had trusted him. The evidence was overwhelming, and Richard's attorneys began exploring plea agreement options that would spare him the embarrassment of a public trial in exchange for full restitution to his victims and cooperation with ongoing investigations into healthcare fraud. But Richard's arrogance and narcissism prevented him from accepting responsibility for his crimes. Instead, he continued to insist that he was the victim of a conspiracy orchestrated by a manipulative adopted daughter who had somehow convinced his dying wife to betray their marriage and family legacy. The criminal trial of Richard Rodriguez began on a cold Monday morning in February, 6 months after Isabella's death and my transformation from homeless victim to determined advocate for justice. The courthouse was packed with spectators, including many of Richard's former patients, medical colleagues, and business partners who had been financially devastated by his decades of fraud and manipulation. Richard entered the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit, his once impressive appearance diminished by months of incarceration and the stress of facing overwhelming evidence of his crimes. He had aged dramatically since Isabella's funeral, and the confident arrogance that had defined his personality had been replaced by the defeated posture of a man who finally understood that his elaborate deceptions could no longer protect him from consequences. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Patricia Hoffman, presented a comprehensive case that detailed Richard's criminal activities spanning over 20 years. The evidence included financial records, recorded phone conversations, testimony from victims, and the extensive documentation that Isabella had gathered during her final year of life. Jennifer Blackwood represented me as a victim advocate, ensuring that my perspective as Richard's abandoned biological daughter was heard alongside the accounts of his fraud victims. The first week of testimony focused on Richard's embezzlement from his medical practice and the manipulation of patient trust funds. Dr. Morrison provided devastating testimony about Richard's pressure on medical staff to falsify records and billing information. 3 elderly patients who had survived Richard's theft of their care funds testified about the impact of his crimes on their health and quality of life during their final years. Mrs. Eleanor Williamson, 84 years old and confined to a wheelchair due to complications from heart surgery, spoke directly to Richard as she described how his theft of her trust fund had forced her to choose between prescription medications and adequate nutrition. "You were supposed to protect me when I couldn't protect myself," she said, her voice trembling with age and emotion. "Instead, you stole my dignity and my security so you could buy expensive gifts for your girlfriend." The testimony about Isabella's investigation into Richard's crimes was particularly powerful. Catherine, who had cooperated fully with prosecutors after being granted immunity for her role in the kidnapping, described Isabella's desperate attempts to gather evidence while battling terminal cancer. She was dying, but she spent her final months trying to protect other people from the man she had trusted for 20 years, Catherine told the jury. She knew she couldn't save herself, but she was determined to save everyone else he would victimize after she was gone. Margaret's testimony provided crucial context about Isabella's motivations and the elaborate planning that had gone into protecting me from Richard's expected retaliation. Margaret revealed conversations where Isabella had expressed fear that Richard would try to destroy me emotionally and financially once he no longer needed to maintain his facade of being a loving stepfather. Isabella's preparations hadn't been about money. They had been about ensuring that I would have the resources and evidence necessary to survive Richard's inevitable attempts at revenge. The revelation of my true parentage was handled with particular sensitivity by the prosecution. DNA evidence confirmed that Richard was my biological father, but the testimony focused on his abandonment and deception rather than demanding any kind of relationship recognition. Expert witnesses explained how Richard's lies about my identity had constituted a form of psychological abuse that had affected my development and sense of self-worth throughout my childhood and young adulthood. Richard's defense team, led by the expensive attorneys he had hired with stolen money, attempted to portray him as a flawed but loving husband who had made financial mistakes under pressure. They argued that Isabella's illness had clouded her judgment and that my influence during her final months had been manipulative and self-serving. However, their strategy crumbled when confronted with the overwhelming evidence of premeditated fraud and the detailed documentation of Richard's criminal planning. The defense's attempts to discredit me personally backfired when Jennifer presented evidence of my nursing career, my academic achievements, and the testimonials from Isabella's medical team about my devoted care during her illness. Character witnesses, including former professors, colleagues, and patients I had cared for, painted a picture of someone with integrity and compassion who had sacrificed personal opportunities to provide care for a dying mother figure. Mr. Thompson, the corrupt attorney who had conspired with Richard, had already pleaded guilty to fraud and conspiracy charges in exchange for testimony about Richard's legal manipulation tactics. Thompson's testimony revealed that Richard had been planning to challenge any inheritance left to me for over a year before Isabella's death, and that they had prepared false documents and fake witness testimonials to support their case. The level of premeditation demonstrated by this evidence eliminated any possibility that Richard's actions could be attributed to grief or emotional distress. The trial's most dramatic moment came when prosecutors played recordings that Isabella had made of Richard discussing his plans to get rid of the charity case after she died. In one particularly damning conversation, Richard could be heard telling Dr. Henderson that he would make sure that little brat understands she has no place in my family once Isabella is gone. The recordings demonstrated not only Richard's cruelty toward me but also his complete lack of respect for Isabella's wishes and his view of their marriage as a financial partnership rather than a loving relationship. Marcus Jr., who had been extradited back to the United States to face kidnapping charges, testified against Richard in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony revealed the family's systematic planning to prevent me from accessing Isabella's estate, including the kidnapping attempt and the media manipulation campaign. Marcus Jr.'s cooperation with prosecutors helped establish the conspiracy aspects of the charges, but it also demonstrated the depth of hatred and entitlement that had motivated the family's actions against me. The sentencing phase of the trial provided an opportunity for Richard's victims to address him directly about the impact of his crimes. Over a dozen people spoke about how his theft and manipulation had affected their lives, their health, and their families. The cumulative effect of their testimony was overwhelming, painting a picture of a man who had used his medical credentials and trusted position to prey on vulnerable individuals for decades. When given the opportunity to address the court before sentencing, Richard continued to maintain his innocence and blame others for his situation. He claimed that Isabella had been mentally unstable and that I had manipulated her into fabricating evidence against him. He showed no remorse for his crimes and no acknowledgement of the pain he had caused to his victims, including me. Judge Harrison, who had presided over the trial with obvious disgust for Richard's behavior, delivered a sentence that reflected the severity and duration of his crimes. Richard received 15 years in state prison for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy, followed by 5 years for the kidnapping charges. The sentences were to be served consecutively, meaning Richard would spend at least 20 years in prison before becoming eligible for parole. The civil consequences of Richard's conviction were equally devastating. His medical license was permanently revoked, and he was ordered to pay full restitution to all identified victims, an amount exceeding $3.7 million. Since Richard's legitimate assets were insufficient to cover the restitution, his home, vehicles, and personal property were seized and liquidated to compensate his victims. Isabella's mansion, which had been the site of so much manipulation and emotional abuse, was transferred to my ownership as part of the estate settlement. However, I had already decided to convert the property into a residential care facility for terminally ill patients who needed compassionate end-of-life support. The house where Isabella had suffered through Richard's betrayals and where I had been thrown out like garbage would become a place of healing and dignity for other families facing similar challenges. The care facility, which I named Isabella's house in honor of the woman who had truly been my mother, opened 8 months after the trial with a staff that included Catherine as director of nursing. The facility provided services that combined medical care with emotional support, ensuring that no patient would face their final months feeling abandoned or financially exploited. The irony was profound. The home where Richard had planned to enjoy his retirement using stolen money became a memorial to the victims of his greed and the testament to Isabella's genuine compassion. 1 year after Isabella's death, my life had been completely transformed in ways I never could have imagined during those terrifying days when I was sleeping in my car and facing false accusations from the man I had believed was my adoptive father. The scared, homeless young woman who had been thrown out of her family home had evolved into a confident advocate for elderly patients and abandoned children, using Isabella's inheritance not just for personal security but as a foundation for meaningful social change. The Isabella Rodriguez Foundation for Vulnerable Families had grown into one of the most respected charitable organizations in the state, providing services that addressed the specific types of abuse and abandonment that Isabella and I had both experienced. The foundation operated 3 major programs: legal advocacy for elderly victims of financial abuse, support services for adopted children aging out of foster care, and emergency assistance for families dealing with terminal illness and associated financial hardship. The Foundation's legal advocacy program had already helped over 200 elderly individuals recover money stolen by caretakers, family members, and professional trustees who had exploited their trust. Working with attorneys like Jennifer Blackwood, the Foundation provided free legal representation to victims who couldn't afford to fight back against financial predators. The program had recovered over $8 million for elderly abuse victims and had successfully prosecuted dozens of cases similar to Richard's crimes. The support services for adopted children focused on providing stability and resources for young adults who aged out of foster care without family support. Having experienced the vulnerability of believing I was dependent on others' charity for my basic security, I understood how crucial it was for adopted children to develop strong self-worth and practical life skills. The Foundation provided scholarships, job training, housing assistance, and counseling services designed to help these young adults build independent, successful lives. The Emergency Assistance Program helped families navigate the financial and emotional challenges of terminal illness, ensuring that no family would face the kind of exploitation Isabella and I had endured. The program provided grants for medical expenses, legal advocacy to protect patients' rights, and counseling services to help families make end-of-life decisions without manipulation or pressure from individuals with financial motives. Isabella's house had expanded beyond the original facility in our former family mansion to include 4 additional locations throughout the state. Each facility was designed to provide compassionate, dignified care for terminally ill patients while protecting them from the financial exploitation that had characterized Richard's treatment of vulnerable patients. The facilities employed over 150 people, including nurses, social workers, chaplains, and support staff who shared a commitment to treating every patient with the respect and love that Isabella had deserved during her own final months. My personal life had also stabilized in ways that felt miraculous after the chaos and trauma of the previous year. Detective Sarah Chin, who had led the investigation into Richard's crimes, had become much more than a professional ally. Our relationship had developed slowly and carefully, built on mutual respect and understanding rather than the desperate gratitude I might have felt toward anyone who helped me during my darkest period. Sarah understood the importance of trust and honesty in relationships, especially for someone who had been deceived and manipulated for decades. Sarah's support had been crucial during the most difficult aspects of recovery, particularly the ongoing therapy sessions that helped me process 20 years of psychological manipulation and identity confusion. Learning that Richard was my biological father while simultaneously discovering the extent of his cruelty and criminality had created complex emotions that required professional guidance to navigate successfully. The therapy helped me understand that Richard's rejection and abuse reflected his own moral deficiencies rather than any inadequacy on my part. Margaret continued to play a vital role in my life, serving on the Foundation's board of directors and providing the kind of unconditional support that Isabella would have offered if she had survived. Margaret's friendship helped maintain continuity with the positive aspects of my childhood while acknowledging the painful truths about Richard's deception. Through Margaret, I stayed connected to Isabella's memory without romanticizing or denying the complexity of our family situation. Catherine had proven herself to be a valuable colleague and friend whose own redemption story provided inspiration for others who had made mistakes under pressure. Her work as director of nursing at Isabella's house demonstrated genuine commitment to the values of compassionate care that had motivated Isabella's final planning. Catherine's experience with manipulation and coercion also made her particularly effective at identifying and preventing elder abuse in healthcare settings. The media attention surrounding Richard's trial and my transformation from victim to advocate had led to speaking opportunities at conferences and universities throughout the country. My presentations focused on recognizing and preventing elder abuse, supporting adopted children through identity development challenges, and building resilience after experiencing family trauma. The speaking engagements provided opportunities to share Isabella's story and to educate others about the warning signs of financial exploitation in healthcare settings. The educational component of my advocacy work had become increasingly important as I pursued a master's degree in healthcare administration through an executive program designed for working professionals. The degree would provide additional credentials for expanding the Foundation's programs and would prepare me to advocate more effectively for policy changes that could prevent abuse like what Richard had perpetrated for decades. Marcus Jr.'s attempts to reconnect with me for financial assistance had provided an interesting test of my emotional recovery and boundary-setting abilities. After serving 18 months in prison for his role in the kidnapping, Marcus Jr. had been deported to London, where he struggled to rebuild his art-dealing business without the financial support he had expected to inherit from Isabella's estate. His attempts to contact me through intermediaries, claiming that we were family and should support each other, demonstrated that he still didn't understand the difference between legal relationships and genuine emotional connections. My response to Marcus Jr.'s outreach was firm but not vindictive. I acknowledged that we had both been affected by Richard's deception and manipulation, but I made it clear that his choice to participate in kidnapping and financial exploitation had permanently damaged any possibility of a relationship between us. The Foundation's mission was to help people who had been victimized by family abuse, not to enable continued exploitation by individuals who had participated in that abuse. Richard's imprisonment had created opportunities for some of his victims to rebuild their lives with the restitution money that had been recovered through asset seizure and civil litigation. Mrs. Williamson, the elderly patient whose trust fund Richard had stolen, had become a vocal advocate for stronger oversight of professional trustees and had testified before the state legislature about the need for better protection of vulnerable patients. Her advocacy work had led to new regulations that made it more difficult for healthcare providers to exploit patient finances. The anniversary of Isabella's death was marked not with grief and trauma, as I had feared, but with a celebration of her legacy and the positive changes her final sacrifice had made possible. The memorial service, held in the garden behind the original Isabella's house, was attended by over 300 people whose lives had been touched by the Foundation's work or by Isabella's example of love and protection for vulnerable family members. During the memorial service, I spoke about the difference between biological family connections and chosen family relationships, using Isabella's love for me as an example of how genuine care transcends genetics or legal status. The audience included adopted children, elderly abuse survivors, healthcare workers, and community advocates who understood that family loyalty must be based on mutual respect and genuine care rather than obligation or manipulation. As I looked out at the memorial garden where Isabella's ashes were buried beneath a beautiful oak tree, I reflected on how her final gift had been much more than financial security. She had given me the truth about my identity, the tools to fight for justice, and most importantly, the understanding that my worth as a person was not dependent on Richard's approval or society's expectations about gratitude and family loyalty. 3 years have passed since that terrible day when I stood on the lawn watching my belongings get thrown out like garbage, and I can honestly say that Isabella's greatest gift wasn't the $33 million she left me. Her true legacy was teaching me that love is a choice, not an obligation, and that real family is built on respect, honesty, and genuine care rather than blood relations or legal documents. The healing journey hasn't been easy or straightforward. Therapy helped me understand that the psychological damage from 20 years of believing I was a charity case who should be grateful for basic love and security couldn't be erased overnight, even with financial freedom and public vindication. Learning to trust my own perceptions after decades of gaslighting required constant conscious effort and the support of people who had proven their integrity through consistent actions rather than manipulative words. The relationship with my biological father will never be repaired, nor should it be. Richard remains in prison, serving his 20-year sentence with no apparent remorse for the lives he destroyed or the pain he inflicted on vulnerable people who trusted him with their care. I visit him once each year, not out of any desire for reconciliation, but as a reminder to myself of how far I've traveled from the scared, confused young woman who once believed she owed him gratitude for basic human decency. During these visits, Richard continues to insist that he was the victim of a conspiracy orchestrated by Isabella and me to destroy his reputation and steal his assets. He shows no understanding that his actions toward me constituted child abandonment and emotional abuse, and he expresses no regret for the elderly patients whose life savings he stole during their most vulnerable moments. These conversations confirm that my decision to build a life completely separate from his influence was correct and necessary for my emotional health. The foundation has grown beyond my original vision, now operating in 6 states and providing services to thousands of families each year. The legal advocacy program alone has recovered over $50 million for elderly abuse victims, while the adoption support services have helped nearly 800 young adults transition successfully to independent living. The emergency assistance program has prevented dozens of families from facing financial exploitation during medical crises, providing the kind of protection that Isabella wished she could have had during her own illness. Isabella's house facilities now employ over 400 people who share a commitment to dignified, compassionate end-of-life care. The original facility in our former family mansion has become a model for other organizations seeking to provide holistic support for terminally ill patients and their families. The irony remains profound. The house where Richard planned to enjoy retirement funded by stolen money has become a place of healing and redemption for people facing their own mortality with grace and courage. My relationship with Sarah has deepened into the kind of partnership that Isabella would have wanted for me. Built on mutual respect, honest communication, and shared values rather than dependency or desperation. Sarah's work in law enforcement gives her unique insight into the psychology of manipulation and abuse, which has been invaluable as I've worked to develop healthy relationships after decades of psychological conditioning. We're planning to marry next spring in the memorial garden behind Isabella's house, surrounded by the people who have become our chosen family. The speaking and advocacy work has evolved into a national platform for education about elder abuse, adoption trauma, and family manipulation tactics. My presentations at medical conferences focus on helping healthcare providers recognize signs of financial exploitation and emotional abuse in family relationships. The feedback from these presentations indicates that Richard's story isn't unique. Many healthcare workers have witnessed similar patterns of abuse but felt powerless to intervene without clear evidence and legal support. The master's degree in healthcare administration, completed 2 years ago, provided credentials that open doors for policy advocacy work at state and federal levels. I've testified before congressional committees about the need for stronger oversight of professional trustees and better protection for adopted children aging out of foster care. The legislation that resulted from these efforts, known as Isabella's Law, requires enhanced background checks and ongoing monitoring for individuals managing vulnerable patients' financial affairs. The educational foundation that emerged from Isabella's estate planning continues to provide scholarships for adopted children pursuing healthcare careers, ensuring that young people with personal experience of vulnerability and trauma have opportunities to become advocates for others facing similar challenges. Over 100 students have received full scholarships through this program, and many have gone on to work in fields that serve vulnerable populations. Margaret remains a central figure in my life, serving as both mentor and surrogate mother figure who helps maintain connections to the positive memories of my childhood while acknowledging the painful truths about Richard's deception. Margaret's friendship has been crucial in helping me understand that Isabella's love was genuine and meaningful despite the complex circumstances surrounding our family relationships. Through Margaret, Isabella's memory stays alive as inspiration rather than tragedy. Catherine's redemption story continues to provide hope for others who have made mistakes under pressure or manipulation. Her leadership at Isabella's house demonstrates that people can recover from poor decisions and contribute meaningfully to preventing others from experiencing similar manipulation. Catherine's experience also serves as a reminder that Richard's network of enablers included other victims who were coerced into cooperation through threats and blackmail. The financial aspects of Isabella's legacy have been managed with careful attention to sustainability and impact rather than personal luxury. The Foundation's endowment has grown to over $70 million through conservative investment strategies, ensuring that the programs can continue indefinitely without depending on additional fundraising. My personal expenses remain modest, focused on education, travel for advocacy work, and maintaining the kind of simple lifestyle that Isabella valued despite her substantial wealth. The question of forgiveness comes up frequently during speaking engagements and therapy sessions. People want to know whether I've forgiven Richard for 20 years of deception and emotional abuse, or whether forgiveness is necessary for complete healing. My answer has evolved over time, but it's become clear that forgiveness isn't about absolving Richard of responsibility for his choices or pretending that his actions didn't cause lasting damage. Instead, forgiveness has meant accepting that Richard's behavior reflected his own moral failures rather than my inadequacy, and choosing to build a future focused on positive contributions rather than revenge or bitterness. The memorial services for Isabella have become annual celebrations of love, protection, and genuine family relationships that transcend legal or biological connections. The attendance grows each year as Foundation staff, program beneficiaries, and community supporters gather to honor Isabella's example of choosing love over convenience and truth over comfortable lies. These gatherings remind everyone present that real family is created through consistent care and mutual respect rather than obligation or guilt. As I stand in the memorial garden today, 3 years after learning the devastating truth about my identity and Richard's cruelty, I can see Isabella's oak tree has grown stronger and more beautiful. The tree serves as a metaphor for the kind of growth that comes from deep roots and honest nourishment rather than artificial support or deceptive appearances. Isabella planted the seeds of truth and justice during her final months, knowing that they would eventually grow into something beautiful and meaningful despite the pain involved in uprooting decades of lies. The scared young woman who believed she owed gratitude for basic love and acceptance is gone, replaced by someone who understands that worth doesn't depend on other people's approval or recognition. Isabella's final gift was the knowledge that I deserved love, respect, and security, not because I was grateful or useful, but simply because I existed as a human being with inherent value and dignity. To anyone watching this story who has experienced family manipulation, financial abuse, or identity deception, please know that healing is possible and that truth eventually emerges no matter how elaborate the lies seem to be. Isabella's example shows that genuine love creates protection and opportunity even after death, while manipulative relationships ultimately destroy themselves through their own contradictions and cruelty. The people who truly love us want us to thrive independently, not to remain dependent on their approval or support. The $33 million was never really the point of Isabella's story, though it provided the resources necessary to fight for justice and build something meaningful from the wreckage of Richard's deception. The real inheritance was the understanding that family is about choosing to love and protect each other rather than exploiting vulnerability for personal gain. Isabella chose me as her daughter not because she felt sorry for an orphan, but because she recognized something valuable in me that deserved nurturing and protection. If you've been moved by Isabella's story of love and protection, I'd love to know where you're watching from around the world. Please share in the comments how this story resonates with your own experiences of family loyalty and chosen relationships. Hit that like button if you believe that real family is built on genuine care rather than obligation or guilt. Subscribe to hear more stories about people who chose love over convenience and truth over comfortable lies. Share this story with anyone who needs to understand that they deserve better than manipulation and exploitation, no matter who is perpetrating the abuse or what justifications they offer for their behavior. Your support helps ensure that stories like Isabella's continue to inspire people to fight for truth and justice even when the odds seem overwhelming. Thank you for taking this journey with me through one of the most difficult and ultimately transformative periods of my life. Isabella's love continues to create positive change in the world through everyone who hears her story and chooses to believe that genuine care is possible, even in families marked by deception and betrayal. May we all find the courage to choose truth over comfort and love over convenience, just as Isabella did during her final courageous months of life.